Hi, I'm Heather from here, booktubes, and today is a discussion video about dubious consent and non-consent in romance books, and specifically how I believe that growing up in purity culture as a independent fundamental Baptist and a evangelical Christian really kind of affected me in this way and made this a thing that I am interested in reading about. This is a pretty controversial topic. A lot of people have very strong opinions about it, and that's understandable. I've been thinking about doing this video for a couple of years now and have just been kind of letting it ruminate and percolate and trying to, have my thoughts as much in order on it as I can. I am someone who enjoys dubious consent and even on some occasions non-consent in my romance books, and why I think that is. The very first thing that I think that we must say is that liking or being interested in dubious consent in a romance book is not at all ever an indication that someone doesn't value consent in real life. I think that consent should be enthusiastic, it should be clear, it should be paramount, it should be something that we hold sacred, and if everybody believed that, then we wouldn't have this issue in the first place, right? So it kind of is actually a controversial topic that consent is important, and yet it is. I think that anyone who has ever felt like they didn't have the power in a situation deeply understands this. I am not a survivor of SA. I have never had that happen to me. So that is not a perspective that I can speak from. I can tell you that survivors of SA fall in a wide spectrum, just like every other group of people. Some really like dubious consent or non-consent in their books, some absolutely despise it. All of those takes are valid and understandable. And I do not think that you can ever be in the right if you are willing to argue with someone that their trauma doesn't matter because you want to just read your little books. There are some survivors who very much do not like that this is a thing in dark romance, and there are some who do. And I think that both are valid, and simply, I will never be arguing with someone about it. And I think that it can be a little iffy, and I think that this is why a lot of times in books that we are talking about how the main character feels disgusting or feels like there's something wrong with them, even though it's a very common fantasy, a very common kink, it's because it can feel like you're cosplaying somebody else's trauma, and that's just never a good thing, right? It's not something that I would ever want to perpetuate or condone. Additionally, before we kind of get into the rest of the discussion, this is not a commentary on my sex life, it is not a commentary on my marriage or on my personal experience, any of those things. This is about romance books, and all of that is off limits. In reality, consent is the bare minimum, right? It's the absolute bare minimum of human decency. It is something that is often violated. Obviously, human decency often doesn't go very far, but it is truly the bare minimum. When you grow up in purity culture, having sex outside of marriage is one of the worst sins that you can commit. For my own personal religion, the way that I was brought up, you need to be saved by Jesus Christ, right? So once you have salvation, you cannot lose it. If you're saved, you're going to heaven. If you are not saved, you're going to hell. It's really as simple as that. It's a clear dividing line. So in my religion, having sex outside marriage, while it can be viewed as ruining your life, it's not something that would send you to hell, right? If you're saved, it doesn't matter what sin you commit, you're still going to heaven. However, it's one of the big ones in that if you were to have sex outside of marriage and your community found out, everybody would know. At the best, they would be disappointed in you. At the worst, they would think that you were an awful person and maybe deserve lots of condemnation. Another huge sin in my Baptist church would have been abortion. So if you do get pregnant outside of marriage, your only choice is to keep the baby because having an abortion would be even worse. But if you're pregnant, then everybody's going to know that you had sex outside of marriage. Also, gay sex, that's even worse. That's even worse. These are things that growing up as a kid, as a literal child who did not even know what sex was, weighed heavily on me. partially because we believed in the rapture. So the rapture is when a trumpet sounds in the air, everybody who is saved goes up in the air to meet Jesus, both dead and alive. Everyone who is not saved is left on earth, and this begins the tribulation. I'm sorry that we're getting into like theology and doctrine, but so that's the rapture. So we were always taught that rapture is imminent. Jesus can come at any time. And so a lot of evangelical young people grow up sure that the rapture is going to happen before they get married, before they have sex, before they have babies, before they are adults. And so that can also put the pressure on, because like you can't have any sexual thoughts at all outside of marriage, but also Jesus is coming and you aren't going to make it to marriage. You know, to believe that, well, I have at least 30 years is wrong. You're supposed to be ready for it at any point. Purity culture and modesty go hand in hand. As a literal toddler, I knew how to fix my skirt. I was not allowed to wear pants. I did not wear pants at all until I snuck it as a teenager. If I got caught, I was in trouble. I lost my pants. And then I was able to actually wear them once I was married and outside the house, which we'll get into that as well. But so modesty is very important, mostly to not tempt men to lust. As a general rule, we believe that consent is the bare minimum, but purity culture really destroys that, because consent is not okay. You are not allowed to have sex outside of marriage. You are not allowed to have sexual thoughts or fantasies or masturbation outside of marriage. For me and the way that I was raised, no kissing, no hand holding. Is a sin for a man to touch a woman if they are not married. 6-inch rule. All of these things were drilled into me from the time that I can't even remember. We're talking as a toddler, I knew these rules. So if no sexual exploration is okay, if giving consent is in and of itself a sin, then the line gets real murky with consent, doesn't it? Because for many people, sex is fine as long as you are old enough being relative, right? We know that 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds are having sex with each other frequently. It's certainly a possibility, right? So for most people, sex is okay if you're old enough and if you're in an appropriate relationship and if you give consent. But if you grow up in purity culture, none of that is okay, which leads to a lot of perversions, as we have seen on national news. If nothing is okay, then everything is equally not okay. So for you, having sex with your boyfriend is okay, but having sex with your teacher or your youth pastor or a sibling is not okay. But for purity culture, it's all equally bad. And I don't know that everyone is necessarily intentionally perpetuating that, but that is kind of what the result is. Pornography is not okay, so child pornography is equally not okay. Like, truly, I think that it messes people up. So I grew up my entire life knowing that I had to wait for marriage, a marriage that I might not live to see, or be an outcast from my society. Everybody would know that I had had sex, and that was one of the worst things that I could do. My dad was a pastor. He believed that if you were not in rule of your house, then you were not qualified to be a pastor. So I knew, again, I don't even know what sex is yet. I could not tell you the ins and outs of it. But I knew that if I were to do such a thing, one, I would probably end up getting pregnant. Again, we didn't have birth control. We didn't have sex ed. Abstinence is the only option. So I knew if I had sex that I would probably get pregnant. I knew that if I had sex, my dad would quit his job because he would feel that he was no longer qualified. I knew that my family would have to move. Our entire social circle was our church. I didn't have any friends that weren't part of my religion. Very rarely interacted with anybody who was not part of my religion. So my entire support system, my entire society, my parents would have loved me and they would not have kicked me out of the house. But to say that they would have been disappointed is an understatement. And I would have felt like not only was I ruining my life, but I was also ruining their lives. This is a lot of pressure for a 9-year-old. a lot of pressure. So long before I knew the particulars of what sex was, I fantasized about enemies to lovers, kidnapping, hostages, being able to have sex without sinning because I had not consented. I had done my best to prevent it. I had never given in. I had never said yes, but I was still having it because in evangelical Christianity, the Holy Spirit and God know your thoughts. Even lustful thoughts are sin. Your thoughts need to be regulated as well. I've heard so many sermons growing up about taking control of your mind and about, thinking on pure things and good things and not allowing your thoughts to be sinful. So if even thinking, I want this, makes it a sin, and being sure not to think I want this, to being sure to fight it, to being sure to being put in a situation where it was outside of your control, that was a loophole. That was a way to kind of think about it. And yes, I still knew that I was doing wrong by thinking about even this, but a sexy pirate grabbed me and kissed me and I was the princess and we eventually, fell in love, that type of thing, based from movies and books and, this mashup of the media that I was influenced by and the purity culture and my own interpretation of it as a child resulted in this being a thing that I thought about a lot. This was my sexual awakening, if you will. And I mean, we're talking ages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, on and on. Again, long before I had any idea what sex was, I was very, very into this idea of being in a fantasy world, in a castle, on a ship, being on a caravan and being attacked, what have you, and falling in love with my captor. And it being okay because I hadn't done anything wrong. Now, there are some purity culture teachings where even if you are assaulted, you are still sinning because you're no longer pure. That was not a thing that I was taught, which I am thankful for, but I will acknowledge that some people do teach that and some people do believe that. And some girls specifically, although we know assault can happen to anyone from any perpetrator, I know that there are girls who have been told that they were not pure anymore and that they had sinned because they were assaulted. Again, at these ages, I was mostly focused on kissing. The pirate kissed me, the knight kissed me, the evil lord kissed me, and that was basically as far as it goes. But again, any touching was completely not okay. I had never had a boy put his arm around me. I had never been able to hug a boy. I had never been able to do anything more physically involved than playing tag with them. And I knew that I would not be allowed to do any of that until I got married. Any healthy sexual appetite up until marriage, sin. Once you're married, automatically everything is okay, basically. Although that does depend on who you ask. So if any healthy sexual appetite is not okay unless you're married, it leads to sexual perversions, and it also leads to very young marriages. It's very common for people in my church to get married at 18, 19, 17, 20, 21, 22. I was 20 when I got married. My husband was 22. My sister was 19. Her husband was 22. And that was normal. That's not like a weird age gap for us. That's not getting married early. Again, you can't move out from your parents a lot of times, and you can't have sex. You can't have kissing. You can't have hand holding. You can't have dates that aren't chaperoned. The two of you are not allowed to be alone together at all. And again, it varies kind of from church to church and from family to family. But for my family, you weren't allowed to do anything until you're married. And who wants to wait until they're 30 to hold hands? It's very common to be married by 22. It's very common for girls to get married without graduating from college. It's very common for our youth to go to Bible colleges that often don't result in real world job opportunities other than being in a full-time ministry. Abstinence is the only acceptable option. Who wants to fantasize about abstinence, especially if you're not ace, right? I think that there are some people who are perfectly fine growing up in purity culture because they don't want sex anyways. That's repulsive. Again, a huge spectrum. So this is not the same for everyone who identifies as ace or demi or aromatic or any of the things. But For some people, it is easier than others. So in a fantasy setting, I could have a world where this could happen and he was not a bad man. I could eventually fall in love with him, right? Because in a contemporary setting, no excuse for it. Consent is consent. But in this fantasy world, we have to be mated together. And yes, we hate each other, but we're going to work through that. It's the same thing that you see in romance books. Villains and enemies and cultural differences, heavily influenced by media, became what I was looking for. Now, in real life, you have consensual non-consent. And again, you have this in romance books as well. However, the consent part is the problem for purity culture. Again, you cannot consent. It is not merely the act of having rough sex or cosplaying. No, no, no. You already gave consent. So you're part of it. You can't fool God. You already said that you were okay with it. As an adult, I can enjoy consensual non-consent in my books, right? I don't think that there's anything wrong with you if you say yes to having sex. But if that's your fantasy, you might not want to say the word. So a lot of times consensual non-consent can be just tell me no, and they don't say anything, and that is their consent, right? You're not making them say the words. I know that some people really don't like this when it comes to consensual non-consent, right? Because consent is important. We agree. Consent is important. But if your fantasy is to not have to give consent, then saying, yes, I consent to this kind of dulls the fantasy a bit. In real life, consensual non-consent or bondage or any sex really requires the trust of your partner. You are only as safe a lot of times as the boundaries that are set in place or the goodness of your partner, the well-placed trust that you're putting them. And if that trust is misplaced, it can easily enter into assault. And it's not your fault. There's nothing that you can do about it, but it's not always safe, right? To enact out fantasies like this, because you have to kind of trust in the goodness of that person. And as we know, the goodness of humanity doesn't get you very far. Even with real life, porn and pornography, again, completely not okay in purity culture, but if you're watching porn and you're watching a dubious consent or a non-consent or a consensually non-consent scene play out, is it ethically sourced? Is everyone actually consenting? Is everyone there voluntarily? How do you know? A lot of times you just don't.
And this is exactly why sex workers should have the same protections in their workplaces as everyone else. Because if you don't have those regulations, if you don't have that safety net, then you're opening up for abuse.
Even though you may think that this is a great option, it's not always going to be. I feel like sometimes it can be a worry. Now, my lines don't have to be the correct lines for everyone, right? I often emphasize this. There are lots of things in books that go outside my comfort zone. My comfort zone is sometimes further than other people's comfort zone, and oftentimes significantly shorter than other people's comfort zone. But my lines don't have to be the lines, right? But what are the lines? That's up for debate. We all debate it. But I'm only comfortable with certain depictions of non-con or dubious consent. For me, I think it very, very much depends on the author, on the tone, on the things that they do with it. It can go very bad very quickly, or it can be one that I really enjoy. For me personally, I don't really like graphic SA or rape or anything on page. I don't like it in general. I don't like it between our couple. There are things that are much, much too far for me personally. And again, that doesn't mean that everybody that goes farther than me is wrong and is icky and is predatory, but there are definitely a lot of scenes that while they fall under the things that I say I like, I don't like. I don't like them. They're too, they leave me with a bad feeling. So what we're saying about real life role playing, pornography, books are the only, I think, they're the only avenue of which no harm has to happen to anybody ever. In books is the only place that you can be in someone else's mind. So in the book, you can be in both characters' minds and know what they're thinking. In real life, that's not possible. You can never ever say, well, I know they were saying this, but I know that they actually wanted it. We know that that's something that abusers and rapists say. We know that that is rape culture. But in a book, you can actually be in someone's mind and you can know what they're thinking. In real life, you need to have explicit consent. And in a book, I think that sometimes you can get away with not having it because you are able to be in their minds. You are able to know how the story ends. You're able to know what they're actually thinking and what they're thinking today and next week, 5 years from now. In my opinion, a book is a great way to be able to explore this role-playing type fantasy with safety and without causing harm or exploitation of anyone else. As much as I disagree with purity culture and will be very much avoiding continuing it with my own children, I don't think that I am damaged. Like, I don't think that the only reason that you can like this kink or you can like these scenes in books is because there's something wrong with you. It doesn't automatically have to be a trauma response. Is it sometimes? Sure, absolutely. And people might say, well, that's not a healthy trauma response. Well, we don't live in a perfect world. Not all of the responses are healthy, and that doesn't mean that they don't still help people to cope. And if you want someone to have healthier trauma responses, then they need to go to therapy, not have a discussion in the romance book community about how dark romance is sick and twisted and you need therapy. If they actually need therapy, then they need therapy, not you. So I'm not ashamed of this kink or this fantasy or liking this in books. I know that I value consent. I am never rooting for someone to be abused. And these things line up for me. I don't feel that they contradict each other. I am very aware that consent is necessary, and I'm also very aware that I enjoy the lack of it sometimes in romance books with a couple that lives a happily ever after. Now, for me personally, I do think that it automatically becomes dark romance if you have a lack of consent. I also think that it works best in a non-contemporary setting. So again, castles, pirates, dragons, fated mates, vampires who aren't human, and why would they think like a human? And then of course you do have some dark romances that are just two humans, but again, you have not good people. And so the fact that they are not good people in this way also kind of checks. So I think that you can be a reader who enjoys this and that be perfectly okay. And I am a reader who enjoys this, and I think that that's okay. And again, if my line is not your line, either because you enjoy things that I think go too far, or because I enjoy things that you think go too far, I think that we can still have respectful discussions. We can still not be telling victims and survivors that they need to shut up because it's just a book. I think that we can not put books above other people and still enjoy our books and still have thoughtful and understanding discussions about why we feel differently about it. So I think that that is everything that I had to say today. We will be having a live show about this in November, so we can have a few different perspectives talking about this specifically in romance books. And if you want to see that, subscribe, and it will be like the second week, I think, in November. I'd love to know your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree. I think that there is a lot of nuance to this discussion. I think it very much depends on which book you're talking about, which reader you're talking about, which author you're talking about. I just think all of that matters. I don't think that you can take a blanket and say it's all bad, it's all fine. I don't think that it is. So I'd just be curious on your thoughts about it. If you grew up in purity culture, do you think that this affected you in a similar way or an opposite way where you value consent above everything else in books, in fantasy settings, in all of the things? You're never okay with the absence of it? Yeah, I would just be really interested in hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much for watching, especially watching the whole thing. I appreciate you. Thanks. Bye.